Hello, everyone. I'm Natalie Turvey, President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what promises to be a fascinating discussion about media and politics in 2025. A special thank you to TD Bank Group, our exclusive J-Talk series sponsor, for making a new year of conversations possible, and to Cision, our in-kind supporter for this event. I'm joining you from Toronto today, and I want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We are privileged to live and work in these territories. A few housekeeping notes off the top. You can submit your questions for our panel at any time using the tab on your screen. And if you missed any of our 2024 talks, you can catch them on our CJF YouTube channel and on our website. We'll be announcing our full winter program in the coming weeks through our newsletter and social media, so be sure to sign up and follow us to stay connected. And if you're enjoying these conversations, please consider supporting the CJF's work. Your donation helps us expand our impact year-round and fosters excellence in journalism. And speaking of upcoming events, mark your calendars for March 6th when we'll present Game Changers, the rising profile of women in sports journalism, showcasing women news leaders and journalists who are transforming sports coverage and examining the growing prominence of women's sports. Now on to our program. Ray Chow, a leading digital executive at Vox, made an interesting observation about the US election when he said, every presidential election is a snapshot in time of the media landscape. And with many south of the border calling this the podcast election, we're seeing just how powerful new media formats have become in shaping political discourse. We're at a fascinating moment in both American and Canadian politics. And as we look toward Trump's second presidency and upcoming changes in Canadian leadership, our media landscape is evolving rapidly. We're seeing increasing polarization, challenges to trust in institutions, and dramatic shifts in how political news is consumed and shared. So how do we navigate this fragmented media landscape while maintaining journalistic integrity? How do we reach audiences who increasingly get their news from non-traditional sources? And critically, how do we uphold our core mission of informing the public when trust in institutions is being challenged? We have an outstanding panel with us today to help explore these questions. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Jackson Proskow is the Washington Bureau Chief for Global News. In Vancouver, Shachi Kurl is the president of Angus Reid International. Based in Ottawa, Paul Wells is a veteran political journalist and host of the podcast, The Paul Wells Show. And here in Toronto, our guest moderator, Jayme Poisson, hosts the daily CBC News podcast, Front Burner. We're honored to have all of you with us. Jayme, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. Shachi, Paul, Jackson, it's great to see you all. And also a big thank you to everybody who registered for this important conversation. Please send your questions in so that I can rip them off as my own during this conversation. No, I'm just joking. I'll certainly give you credit, but please do send them in because I'll be able to see them coming in live. But maybe let's start here. Shachi, I think it would be helpful to start by trying to get a sense of where people are at here on some of these issues. And I just wonder if you could take us through some of your work on this. How does increasing antagonism toward the press show up in your polling data? And are there any surprising findings about which Canadians are most likely to distrust the media?
So thanks, Jayme, and it's great to be with you. And hey, Paul, and hi, Jackson, and hi, everyone on screen. So what I would do is actually almost start by deconstructing that question and starting from where is the antagonism coming from, and you already hit it, Jayme, with the lack of trust aspect. So where is that coming from? Why are people feeling more checked out from mainstream news organizations that and I'm a pollster in my role at the Angus Reid Institute. I do polling now, but I am a former journalist, a former political journalist, for those of you who don't know that. So we like to, uphold and remind people that, mainstream news organizations adhere to standards and norms and fact checking and all of those things. Well, one data point that I'll start with that will make you cry is that 30% of Canadians are of the view that facts are subjective, like facts are not facts, and they are arguable. So let's just start there. But let's also talk about consumption and the way people consume news. And we already have a sense of it in terms of where they're consuming news now, more online, more on podcasts and situations like that. But we're already seeing a world wherein, only 19% of people are consuming news from legacy print organizations. When they think about online news, I mean, yes, some of that again is legacy news organizations, but a lot of it is the podcasts, and it's the long form stuff, and it's the interviews, and it is the Joe Rogans, and it is the Jordan Petersons. It's everything mushed in together. And then I think the other piece is that Canadians are not seeing themselves in terms of what they see reflected back in news reporting. So whether that's gender, particularly older women, this will not surprise you, over the age of 55, say they do not see themselves, their gender, women their age, reflected back. The concerns, I think you've seen a bit of, and I'm all over the map here, but I don't care. You're starting to see a little bit of that just in reporting on things like women's health in their 50s, and reporting on menopause and perimenopause. But prior to that, you weren't seeing any of that. Right. Or whether people are talking about seeing their region reflected in reportage, or seeing, their background or their political views. So you have a situation where if you are outside Ontario, Quebec, and to a lesser extent the Atlantic provinces, and looking at so-called political reporting or parliamentary reporting in Canada today, a couple of non-polling stats. I mean, the vast majority of political reporters covering politics in Canada today at the national level have never lived anywhere outside of Ontario, or to a lesser extent, Quebec. I remember having a great chat with Ian Bailey of the Globe and Mail, who's a Vancouverite like me, a couple of months ago. I said, everyone here is from Ontario now. It didn't used to be that way. You used to have regional news organizations that sent their own person to Parliament Hill to cover that area back to their readers. And Ian's like, no, Shachi, we have 3 now. We have 3 from the West. All of these things sort of just are elements like dirty dishes set to soak in a kitchen sink that just sort of add to that grossness in terms of the way people are reacting to or turning away from legacy media. And it does find itself reflected in levels of trust. 47% as of last year of 18 to 34-year-olds say news organizations, mainstream news organizations, can't be trusted.
Almost 50% of
correct
18 to 34-year-olds?
Correct, wow. Yes. And that's just 18 to 34-year-olds. Around the total population, it's 39%. So a plurality. Yeah.
So, but younger people are more likely to
especially. Yeah.
Okay. Paul, I think it would be good to bring you in here now. So you would have started your career at a time when there was a good handful of sources that people consumed in the country, right? Like the National was a much-watched, Maclean's was the political magazine to read. Yep. Now you write your Substack, which I know for many people is a must-read, but obviously would not be the same kind of reach that the National had in its heyday. As Shachi said, people are turning to podcasts, to independent outlets more. I think they're also just getting their information on social media. And just how are you thinking about the evolution and the impact that this is having on our political discourse? We can start there, I guess.
So Shachi's right. I came to Ottawa in 1994. I was the junior person on a 3 man bureau for the Montreal Gazette. In the last years of the 1990s, Calgary Herald had a reporter in Ottawa, the Edmonton Journal, the Vancouver Sun, the Windsor Star, the Hamilton Spectator, and on and on and on. And I believe there's pretty close to as many people in the press gallery as there were then, but it seemed that they were working for more different organizations back in the olden days, but really in the last days before the internet. And they were there because in your hometown, you really had access to, 3 American TV networks, the kind of 3 big Canadian TV networks, the Globe and Mail, and your local newspaper. And so your local newspaper had to tell you what the people in Ottawa were doing that reflected your town. And they were able to do that because news organizations were swimming in money. Because news organizations were the only place where your local newspaper was the only place where you could advertise retail goods and services, whether you were a local restaurant or the movie theater, or whether you just had a futon to sell. And so the amount of money that was available to journalism in those days is just, it's beyond compare with what's available to any news organization now. So I came from the Montreal Gazette. The Montreal Gazette had, in addition to 3 reporters in Ottawa and 2 in Quebec City, it had a full-time food writer, it had a full-time theater critic, it had 2 movie writers and a rock and roll writer, and I could go on and on and on. It had regional bureaus around Montreal. And all of that has gone away. So as we lament the fact that things are changed, almost the only insight I have that might not be obvious to a lot of people is that status quo ante, the good old days that older journalists remember and miss, was itself a weird market bubble. It was a product of the way money tended to pool in the local newspaper in any community. And you're not going to get that back. As soon as the internet makes it possible for people to cut out the middleman for their commerce, it makes it possible for them to slash funding that they never intended to go to journalistic activities in the first place. They just had food they needed to sell.
Yeah.
And so journalists are to some extent like the only people who benefited from the Dutch tulip bulb frenzy in the late 1600s, and we wish that people would get back to buying tulip bulbs. Ain't going to happen, and that's the kind of the downer insight with which I enter any of these conversations.
But then, I suppose, what's the impact of that then on our democracy, right? Like, was it healthier back then? Where the discussion? I'm just trying to figure out how we get to the point where almost 50% of young people in this country don't trust legacy news organizations. So
I'd be curious to know how many people trusted us back when we were the only game in town. But it's reasonable to suspect that the number was at least a little higher because people couldn't shop around for news organizations they found more congenial back in the day. I think it has deeply impoverished our democratic conversation. I think that there are, I don't know who needs more political columnists, but the fact is that 10, 20, 30 years ago, there were a hell of a lot more from different backgrounds, from different parts of the country, who were engaged in at least a sort of rudimentary national conversation the day after a big news event. And now everyone is allowed in, and everyone can comment on Twitter. But when it was a little less fluid like that, the expertise and the access and all of the things that drive quality journalism tended to clump up more. We just saw a candidate for the leadership of one of the biggest political parties go to Jon Stewart to talk to him.
Yeah.
And we're seeing many more cases like that where the people who theoretically have experience and expertise are being bypassed because it's the easiest thing in the world to bypass them in a search for people who will ask easier questions.
Yeah, probably worth mentioning here. I mean, you're talking about Mark Carney, obviously, who just did the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, but also the opposition leader Pierre Poilievre just did a podcast with Jordan Peterson, which, you know, according to David Coletto over at Abacus Data, 1 in 5 Canadians said that they watched all or some of, which was a number that really threw me for a loop. That's an enormous reach. Jackson, do you want to chime in here? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening, more so to an extent in the US, but probably coming soon to Canada, is that people are blurring the lines between news and what I would more broadly call information or discussion of the news, right? So when you look at people who are pivoting to getting their news from TikTok, which are going to be the people who skew younger, Pew actually had a study out on this in the fall that said if you're getting your news from TikTok, you are 50-50 chances you're getting that from a established organization versus an influencer or a celebrity. And of course, we all know the difference is somebody going out and gathering facts and checking those facts versus someone just talking about things in the news. But the people consuming the news that way, I think, are treating them almost as equal. That being said, I would also say that the news is not all dire. I think we understand that fundamentally the business model of news organizations in Canada is deeply broken, and nobody's questioning that. People still want mainstream interpretation and presentation of the facts, though. And if I can share one little anecdote here, I work at Global News. Our biggest competitor would arguably be CTV. In the past year, CTV has thrown in the towel on covering weekend news in local markets outside of, I believe it's Toronto and Montreal are the only ones that are left. Well, those people haven't disappeared. They're coming to us in droves. We've never done better in the ratings as a news organization because we continue to provide a stable, confident brand, and people are coming to us. And the last thing I will add is that, again, despite the dire financial situation, I think the lesson for organizations everywhere is that if you meet viewers where they are, if you meet them on social media, if you meet them on YouTube, they're going to follow along and they're going to find you. CBC, I believe, just passed 1 million subs on TikTok here in the past few weeks. We are at 4.5 million on YouTube. We have a digital channel that's available on Amazon. It does really well. So people are craving information from real credible sources. Even if they're questioning sort of the authenticity of mainstream outlets at a time when there are alternatives. So I think the point is we can be the alternative. We just have to be in the spaces where people are looking for their news.
I wonder how you would respond to somebody who would say that, listening to the interview with Poilievre and Jordan Peterson, or even to use you as examples, Trump on Rogan, taught them more about the candidate than anything that the so-called mainstream media could produce. This is something that you hear a lot. Why do you think we hear that? And do you think there's merit to it?
I think it's a format question, to be honest. I work for a newscast that's half an hour long, full of stories that are 2 minutes long. We just don't have the vehicle or the venue to give that kind of audience. And it's not to say that we shouldn't try and branch out and develop it. But I think people are also craving a level of authenticity that a host like Joe Rogan, who's just a guy sitting in a chair asking everyday, normal, average person questions without sort of an air of elitism to it, can bring. And I think that's maybe a blind spot for the mainstream media.
Paul, Shachi, do you want to come in here? I want to spend a bit of time on this question in part because I think that our response often is like, no, you're wrong. Like, you're wrong to think that you're gleaning stuff out of the Jordan Peterson podcast, or listening to Trump talk to Aiden Ross, or Mark Carney even on the Daily Show. And I'm not really sure that's the right way to be responding here, but I would throw it to either of you guys.
Or the Prime Minister on Jake Tapper. There's also I don't totally mean this pejoratively, but there is an ethos within the journalism circles that the politicians come to us. We get the big gets. How dare we be bypassed? How dare you not talk to us? But I also want to pick up on something Jackson just said, which is he's got, Global's got this channel on Amazon. Well, doesn't that feel like the venue for long form, long information interviews that can maybe take the temperature down on what is naturally and frankly should be the adversarial nature of journalist interviewer questioning hard questions to high profile policy making guests. And so this is again part of that tension around he summed it up so well, the reporting side of it or the journalism side of it versus the news and information side of it. And I think newsrooms are going to have to, or news organizations are going to have a bit of a sit down and a come to Jesus around, okay, well, these are our, I remember if you had to go beat someone up in an interview who was an important source to you, you called in a buddy or a colleague to go do that really hard interview so that you didn't burn a relationship that would then give you access to more information either on the record or off the record. Anyway, all of which to say, I think there is some sort of tension reckoning that is going to happen around the acceptability of doing those softer interviews if they do glean information, but also understanding and accepting the risk that there's no fact checking there. Trump can say whatever he wants. Poilievre can say whatever, Carney can say whatever he wants. And that's the other side of it. That's the problem that goes with the advantage or the potential benefit.
Paul, anything you want to add here before we move on?
I think people have always got their news at different sort of scales. I really enjoyed sharing an office until about 2018 with the Rogers Radio reporters in Ottawa who were producing 40-second things as fast as they could right after something had happened. Set up, 15-word quote, conclusion, send it out, retop for the next hour. And because an awful lot of people are getting their news that way as they drive around or in a radio that is still working in their office or in their shop. And it's interesting to keep in mind that that's one way that it happens. These podcast interviews, I mean, look, I'm not the world's biggest fan of Jordan Peterson, but Poilievre was relaxed and discursive, and he said an awful lot of stuff that should be useful to any voter in the hour and 40 minutes that they were talking. And that's the way I approached it. I wasn't there, when I wrote about it. It wasn't my job to comment much on Jordan Peterson. He's not running for office. I just took it as a spigot where we get more information about the guy who was.
Okay. I want to spend a bit of time. But sorry, let me just ask you one more question about the Poilievre thing. How much does it worry you though that he really did have a lot of free reign there, right? Like at one point, Poilievre and Peterson essentially kind of agree with each other. This is just one example that racism was like invented and sort of newly imported to Canada, which obviously a lot of people would disagree with. And then it just kind of goes there, goes out into the world unchecked. And so, how much pause does that kind of stuff give you? And I'm not saying every journalist would have caught that. I'm not.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it doesn't get caught in the sense that, anyone who didn't like any part of what was said can rebut it on their favorite social media.
Right, you could write about it.
There was quite a bit of commentary, more than usual after a political event. There was quite a bit of commentary, both in relatively new media like Substack and Blue Sky and whatever, and then also newspaper columnists and the ad issue panel and stuff like that for days afterwards. So and I honestly do think that a lot of people see fact checking as sort of tone policing more than fact checking. They see CNN, who hired a good Canadian reporter to fact check Donald Trump for years, and then suddenly he was on TV a lot less often during the Biden presidency. I do believe that Trump has a lot more trouble telling the truth than Biden did, but some central facts of the Biden presidency, like that he was barely hanging on, that somehow was not fact checked, and so I think that I think it's sometimes healthy for us to have our own assumptions questioned.
Yeah, fair. Just to move on here, I want to talk a little bit about what it's like for journalists operating in this environment. One thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is that political actors really across the spectrum are seizing on all of this polarization and mistrust in the media, and journalists are now more often than ever before, I think, finding themselves in situations where people covering them are also trying to prove a point, right, in the moment. And I'm thinking, for example, of these news conferences that Poilievre keeps having where some journalist will ask him a question that he might not like, and then he comes back to them and he's like, well, this is a question from the state-funded CBC or the state-funded Canadian press, et cetera, et cetera. And, what advice might you have for journalists trying to navigate that environment right now?
Me?
Sure. Yeah.
I think people are going to come at us with their priors more than they ever have before, and they're going to use there's a French term, to make an arrow out of any available wood. They're going to use any pretext. So I've been spending part of my day, more than I should, watching the debate over Mark Carney on Jon Stewart, and just an astonishing number of conservatives are discovering their horror at the thought that any Canadian could whore himself out to an American comedy talk show, and like I've seen a lot of and a lot of liberals are discovering that Jon Stewart is the touchstone of authenticity and credibility in North American media, and it's all baloney. It's because Carney's a liberal, and if Poilievre went on, whoever the guy is on Fox News who's got a late night talk show, if he went on that show tonight, the polarities would reverse. So now, it gets tricky when you've got a guy who seems likely to lead the next government who has a stated policy of shutting down the public broadcaster. I've got a lot of colleagues who work for the public broadcaster. I get freelance income from the public broadcaster, and that puts all of those people in a direct conflict of interest, which we sort of all have to navigate. But denying that it's so, I don't think is very useful. I've got colleagues who just insist that the fact that the CBC gets its money from taxpayers, and a lot of us get our money from the CBC, is a silly trifle that nobody should mention because it's beneath our dignity. Well, like who are we trying to fool? It's out there. This question, which is a central policy question in the next election, is simply out there. And we needn't waste our time trying to pretend that it's not.
Yeah. Jackson, do you want to come in here? Because you would have been dealing with some of this dynamic, certainly, in the US election, right? And so what would you say to journalists navigating this right now? It's not an easy line to walk.
Yeah, I would say I've dealt with this dynamic dating back to my days covering Toronto City Hall and Rob Ford, where the media were a favorite target for the mayor and his brother.
Me too, me too, yeah.
Yeah, of course. And, generally I say, don't take the bait. Don't get bogged down in this. It's not about us. And if a person in politics wants to come out and say horrible things about reporters, oh, well, that is a distraction from why we're all there, right? Ultimately, as journalists, it's our job to be oppositional, not partisan, and that can feel like it's a fine line to walk, but being oppositional just means asking tough questions. Don't let it get personal, excuse me. And remember that your credibility is your brand. So that credibility has to be unimpeachable. So if somebody is trying to, as they say, it's mud wrestling with a pig, right? You both get dirty, but the pig likes it. That's kind of how I feel when politicians start attacking the press.
Shachi, would you agree with that? Or would you like to see maybe not individual journalists, but media organizations stand up for themselves more or do more here? What do you think the role is here?
Maybe I'm being completely Pollyanna. Maybe I've been outside of daily journalism so long that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. But when I one particular newsroom I worked in, like politicians were banned from the 6 o'clock broadcast in a day when the 6 o'clock broadcast was a big deal. Like, to run a clip of a politician, it had to be like you had to be able to find a way to tell the story without the scrum, without the presser, without the back and forth. And I sometimes think now that journalism and journalists who are under attack and who are, basically putting themselves up to get punched in the face by certain politicians every day they try to do their job, are also too much locked in the wrestling in the mud with the pig, as opposed to going back and just saying, okay, you're bypassing me, I'm going to bypass you. So can we tell a story on carbon pricing without the clip from the political talking heads? Can we tell the story about inflation without the Chrystia Freeland vibe session? Like, whatever it is, one of the things that concerns me greatly, and so going back to how do you approach, maybe it's we turn the tables, and one of the things I've had to learn as a pollster is actually how to ask better questions. It is a great discipline for figuring out how to ask questions, which I now wish I could go back and apply to reporting. But I wish that we were getting deeper on issues and doing more explainer journalism and more like, how does this work and why is this important? And just like the basics, because civics is out the window. Nobody understands social studies anymore. Like, they don't know their history. They don't know how things work. And so there's, I think that, the alma mater that I did my journalism degree from, there's so-called political reporting vertical is actually called, or was for a time, I think it still is, parliamentary reporting. Well, covering Parliament is important, and the ins and outs and the motions and the daily business of the House, there is a role and a function for that, but that's not all there is to political reporting. What happens on the Hill is not the extent and the limit of political reporting. Political reporting is people reporting. And I would say that maybe that's something that the collective, all of us, need to be thinking about more.
Paul, would you agree with that?
Well, absolutely. Up to a point. I've had occasion to look at all the work that Canada Land does over the last little while, and it's an excellent reminder that a lot of public issues are about things that happen to people in their community. Do they feel safe in the downtown? Can they eat and find shelter, within the normal range of affordability for a typical family, and so on and so on. I do remember fondly, though, that when we launched the National Post, we launched with a daily Parliament page, and it was as though Canadian journalism had discovered Parliament. And we had the field all to ourselves for the longest time, because everyone had talked themselves into believing that what happens in institutions doesn't matter. But I'll tell you, we've got a Supreme Court here, whether we like it or not, and there isn't a single reporter in Canada whose full-time job is to cover the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
That is asinine. That is asinine. We actually tried to get some of that sweet federal local reporting fund money at Maclean's, and our pitch was that the local news desert that nobody was covering in our town was the Supreme Court of Canada. And it was I just thought it was a brilliant idea, and perfectly okay. The powers that ran that program didn't like they thought it was a program that was designed to cover Leamington and Okotoks and stuff like that. So they gave us a pass, but it was fun trying. And I maintain that is a news desert that is that nobody is served when that is when the Supreme Court is spared journalistic scrutiny in a very old-fashioned sense.
Well, related to that, just if we could kind of move into some potential solutions here. If you are like a legacy news organization trying to gain more trust, like what is the answer here? What should they be doing? Whether you're the,
Yeah. I think so. I just read I spent part of last summer reading a fascinating new book about the modern history of the New York Times, a book called The Times by Adam Nagorny, who's a reporter there. And one thing that he indulges at length is the extent to which, in a large organization that was the king of the hill, it was absolutely commonplace for the reporters there to have very broad discussions about the appropriateness of covering a given topic, not just discussions, ardent debates, angry debates about whether we should be on a story or not, whether the angle was the correct angle or not. And as newsrooms have shrunk, those debates have gone away. And I think our audiences are actually correct to suspect a certain level of automaticness and groupthink in the decisions. Whereas there used to be debates. And one thing I would recommend everyone do, what I try to do in my one-man office, writing for tip money, is to almost artificially recreate those debates. Am I taking the right angle? Am I being too tough on X or Y? Am I not being tough enough on X or Y? In a world where everyone is second guessing our decisions, it's a kind of a Zen thing, but what I try to do is not fight back against the fact that everyone's second guessing. I try and be a little bit more active in second guessing myself. And that would be advice that I would offer for free to colleagues.
Jackson, I see you, I don't know, nodding your head.
Nodding vigorously,
yeah. Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think generally, as in a broad sense, we do a really lousy job of sort of failing to acknowledge our blind spots. And if you want to look at the US example, Biden's health and obvious decline were a classic example of that, where it almost felt like because a lot of the videos of Biden sort of faltering and stumbling off into the wilderness were circulating amongst right-wing figures on social media, I think a lot of journalists trapped themselves into thinking, well, this is just a conspiracy theory. We don't need to go in that direction. And then they weren't really pushing back as hard as they should have against a White House that was assuring them that everything was fine. Caught in the middle is an audience that's looking at this and saying, I'm seeing this with my own eyes and you are not talking about it. Things like that are awful for the broad brand of mainstream reportage. So I think we really need to be so much better at acknowledging why we're covering or not covering certain things. And then back to the idea of fragmentation, I think that the sort of way to keep people in the fold or bring new people into the fold is to give them what only mainstream outlets can do, which is a lot of times access, a lot of the times it's context, and divorcing that from pure opinion. And the fact that, at least in the world of TV, we still go to stories, right? We still have a crew in California right now covering that. Other agencies have bailed on things like that. But I think those types of investments, helping people understand where in this moment in history a certain event of the day fits, those are the types of things that I think can do really, really well. And I think just sort of in that note, when you look at a lot of the sort of information content that does well on TikTok, a lot of the times it's a news influencer doing an explanation of an angle of something, right? So clearly there's a thirst to maybe understand a little more nuance and depth on issues. We've got the skills to do it.
But let me then pick up on that and maybe in some ways push back on what you were saying. Is that it does strike me that people are gravitating towards information sources that have that have their own way of looking at the world, right? That see the world through a certain kind of lens. And they like that they're leaning into that lens. And so, like, what do you think about the argument that that's actually the direction that people should go? That's actually where people want to be.
I would push back on that strongly. I mean, here in the US, you have a highly polarized mainstream media, right? You have outlets that are ostensibly partisan, like MSNBC or Fox News. Their ratings are not anything to write home about. I mean, and sort of the mainstream broadcasts that are in the middle are seeing their audience decline because of that polarization. And what ends up happening, MSNBC just lived through this. As soon as they pivoted to openly questioning Biden's fitness because it was a mainstream topic, their audience fled in droves. And then after Biden lost, their audience just completely cratered. So I think, it's pretty clear that that is not a sustainable formula for a mainstream outlet. So I think it's, again, as we talked about, meeting people where they are, different platforms, different formats. But I think keeping credibility and objectivity as your brand is still the healthiest for any media organization that wants a long-term strategy.
Shachi, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. Maybe we don't have to talk about just the big guys, right? But some of the independent guys as well. I'm thinking about some Canadian outlets like The Breach, which is clearly like coming from like a left perspective. And I'm not saying that they're throwing facts out the window, but they're my understanding, outlets like that are finding an audience. And maybe one example I can talk about here that I hear a lot is the sort of mainstream coverage of Gaza, where a lot of people have said to me that they feel like this objectivity that the mainstream media has applied to what's going on there is like has turned them off, right? Is hypocritical. And then they have been pushed to other places, and this is where they feel like they found a home. And so, do you think that there's like more space for that kind of stuff?
Okay, so yeah, let's just throw me into the deepest end of like the thing that'll get me killed, sure, in terms of not literally killed. I don't mean to sound that way, but it's like there is no good way to answer some of these questions. But what I can speak to is, yes, the polarization, the polarity, the conflict in terms of the way we look at public opinion, or the way people are approaching it or writing into us spontaneously. Your polls are so biased, and the same the journalists, it's so biased, but you're getting the equal amount of outrage from people on both sides of the conflict. It's not just the conflict is a more recent example. Certainly the convoy protests were a big part of that. Doubts about vaccination, all of those things that have come out of moments. I guess what I want to pick up on two things that Jackson talked about, but in relation to what you're talking about, I think transparency. So if you have a left-leaning news outlet or organization or publication outlet that says, yeah, we come at this with a left point of view. This is who we are, and this is what you're going to get. I mean, the Post, I think now is pretty out there about, hey, we are a right of center point of view, and this is who we are, and this is whether you agree with it or not. I think it's the transparency of it, and it does go all the way back to an era before sort of the post-war just the facts man golden age of newspapers, where you had media barons that had the right of center paper or the left of center paper, and certainly you still have that tradition in Britain with the UK media, right? The Guardian has a point of view on something, the Telegraph has a point of view on something. But going back to a little bit about sort of what's the future, how to deal with it, I would say that we've also, in the last 15 years, I think for good and noble and well-intentioned reasons, have confused diversity, big D diversity, with diversity of voice. and I can say that as somebody who is a woman of color, like it was important to see more representation in the ranks of journalism for people who look like me and people who come from other various backgrounds. But that's not diversity of voice. And so I think there is a mindset that probably needs to just be course corrected by a couple of degrees, because it will make a big difference down sort of in the long term around understanding that the groupthink aspect of it is coming from a lack of different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching issues, and what Paul talks about, having those internal debates. You can have the most big D diverse newsrooms, you can have everyone coming from different life backgrounds, but just because you're from a different racial or religious background, if you're a university educated reporter who's coming from a similar educational aspect, if they're urban, if they've got the same socioeconomic background, there's not going to be a lot of diversity of voice. There's not going to be a lot of lived experience that informs the reporting.
Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything there, but I was also going to ask you, before we move to audience questions, where you see some bright lights in this country. Obviously your Substack and podcast.
Obviously.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of journalists doing a lot of fantastic work. I am sometimes asked to mentor younger journalists, and I do a sort of a gut check every time. Do I feel at all comfortable encouraging people to get into this line of work? And I still do it because there may be fewer opportunities than there ever were, but there are still opportunities, and then the question is, what do you make of them? Sutherland Quarterly is the series of small 100-page books that I've written 2 of in the last 2 years. The next one coming out in a couple of weeks, a young reporter, a 26-year-old reporter for the Calgary Herald, a business reporter who's not particularly on the beat that his book covers, but he's written a short book about the Jasper wildfires last season, and gets what had seemed obvious to me, that if there's a place that's taking 25,000 words worth of reporting every few months, you want to get on that train. I hope that more people are going to get in the habit of looking around for surprising opportunities, are going to take it. One last thing I want to talk about. One of the most fascinating things that I witnessed during the U.S. presidential election was the number of center-left, Democratic-leaning voters who became convinced that their favorite news organizations were campaigning full-time for Donald Trump. These are people who thought that the New York Times and Politico and CNN were in the tank for Donald Trump because they had spotted CNN carrying a live feed of a Trump rally, and they hadn't carried every one of Kamala Harris's rallies that week. It's an astonishing thing, and I think it reflects a move from a client mindset among news audiences to a proprietor mindset. People understand that subscription revenue is a bigger ingredient of newsroom at some subcutaneous level. They understand that they are players now where they simply used to be spectators in an advertiser news organization relationship. And they demand the kind of feed that they want. I call it pinch to zoom. If you've ever seen a baby leafing through a magazine, when they get to a photo, they go like this to make the photo bigger because they expect a magazine to behave the way an iPad does. Similarly, our audiences who can curate every part of their life, they can order out for the sourdough
sourdough anything
culture, yeah, you know.
Yeah.
And so they get so mad when CNN is just what CNN wants to be, and they don't, and they have less and less patience for that. It seems quirky, but I'll tell you, the Washington Post is very nearly out of the game because a bunch of Washington Post subscribers spent the year deciding they don't want to subscribe anymore. That's that's something that every newsroom manager has to keep in mind.
Right. I actually have a Washington Post question from one of our attendees. But before I read it and we move to questions from the audience, and please send them in if you're watching. Any final words, Jackson, Shachi? Thank you so much.
Yep.
Okay, then let me give you this one then, Jackson, first, because I think you'll like it. Okay, is this from Faye? It's troubling to see some of the mainstream media start to change their missions and become more polarized, e.g. the Washington Post. Is this the beginning of the death of unbiased reporting, or does unbiased reporting even exist, depending on ownership of news media?
No, I think there's plenty of unbiased reporting out there. Actually, I think it's to Shachi's point that really the issue is the lack of diversity of storytelling, right? And so it's that idea that people feel that there is groupthink in what assignments are. I think the room sort of for independent, unbiased reporting is huge, and I think what we need are more and more news organizations that are willing to take risks in telling stories that maybe aren't the natural center of the road story, not from a different ideological perspective, but just from a diversity of storytelling perspective.
Okay. Here's one from Rachel. Do you think initiatives to increase civic literacy or media literacy among Canadians could help encourage Canadians to consume and support journalism? I feel like we've been talking about this for a long time now. Shachi, any thoughts on this one?
I mean, yeah. I think I worry more about just the crumbling of critical thinking at a time when so much information and so much unchecked information is coming at us. Like just the notions of your spidey sense, and is this really real, and where do I go to find out if this is actually real? And just because just because it's on the internet or just because it's on TikTok. And so how do we actually arm news consumers and news and information, to Jackson's point, news and information consumers to find their own way around trying to really delineate what's garbage and what's real? We're not. I worry about kid. I mean, oh my God, the old woman shakes her fist at cloud, like, but I worry about the kids today. That's what I'm worried about.
Here's one. With elections moving at both the federal and provincial and Ontario levels of government, why is there not more in-depth reporting on the 4 Canadian parties and their past performances and platforms going forward, and on the impact of these choices? Is from Patricia. Would anybody like to take that? Here's another one. If I mean, this is sort of related to what we were talking about, but I wouldn't mind asking it again. So this is from John, who follows Paul on Substack and pays for it, along with the CBC, Globe, and Toronto Star. In my choices, I'm operating in a silo, but I'm disinclined to seek out alternative sources. What am I missing, if anything? Paul, is John missing anything?
It sounds like he's got a pretty healthy news diet to me. Yeah, I simply think it's like in the olden days that I'm describing, where you had 3 Canadian networks, 3 American networks, Globe, and your local paper. It was pretty easy to tell yourself that you had a decent angle on the media universe. If you knew what Roger Ebert thought of the latest movie, and you'd seen Nightline last night, Kids Ask Your Parents, like you felt like you could sleep pretty soundly. Now nobody could convince themselves that they're getting, and even if you're not intentionally curating your news feed, I think a lot of us worry that we're doing that unintentionally, that we're missing out on something because we've managed to construct an echo chamber. On the question of why isn't there more in-depth coverage of politics, part of the answer is simply that it costs money. But I'll tell you this, at Maclean's, every election since we were able to measure our traffic for individual stories, the absolute through-the-roof leader in our traffic, really a driver of our traffic for every election period, was a very simple feature where we tabulated the promises that all the parties were making on various subject areas, with no attempt to parse it or criticize it or say this was better than anyone. We just had a place on the website where you could go to see what the parties were promising, and people came to it in stampedes every time. I always found that fascinating.
Yeah, I'll say we can always see very quickly the episodes that do well on front burner through the charts, and this kind of stuff, same. Just like what this party says that they're going to do, the history of the carbon tax. We did one the other day that was just on like the fast trains, and just it is there really is like an appetite out there for just information downloads. There's one more that I wanted to ask you guys that I just saw that I thought was really interesting, and now I can't find it. Oh, this is from Anne. Can legacy media move beyond the trap of promoting outrageous statements and shocking proposals through hourly repeats of their news clips? Jackson, I suppose the question is, first is, does Anne have a point? Do you agree with at least some of what she might be saying there? And then, maybe you want to take her question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we need to. I really do. Again, if we're living in a place where we accept the idea that facts and truth feel increasingly murky to our audience, then what are we doing to distinguish ourselves? Well, repeating a bunch of bombastic statements from people probably isn't getting us there. And so I would argue that we're in a place where we need less what I call fire hose reporting, where you report that this person said this, and then that person said that, and then somebody else said something else. That's not helping anybody. Instead, what we can do as mainstream organizations is provide the context, tell you, if you're going down the path of evaluating those statements, what did these people say in the past? Or do you ignore those statements and really focus on the implications of the thing that is most likely to happen, help people understand where that fits in the broader context of everything that's going on, and help them understand what it means for them. And I think moving away from just politician says crazy thing to here's what that means for you if it actually happens is going to benefit everybody.
Okay. And I think I'm going to do one more that I just got. I'm going to take a quick read of it. It's long. This is from Bobby. Actually, I'm just going to read this on spec, guys. Bobby, let's see. Since 2008, about 40 daily newspapers, 400 community newspapers, 42 radio stations, and 11 television stations have disappeared in Canada, according to a recent study by TMU, University in UBC. That collapse has happened as advertising and domestic media outlets have plummeted to a point where 70% of Canadian ad expenditures are paid to foreign-owned digital media. Should news laws or modification of actual laws, such as the Income Tax Act, which allows for organizations to claim tax credits for advertising spent over internet platforms, mostly outside Canada, should be put in place, or is free market still the way to go for media? I think the question he's asking here is like, how do you guys think the government could step in here? I think ultimately, maybe, of course, they have done a bunch of stuff, money that's gone to funding journalists' salaries, et cetera. But does anybody have any other thoughts on how government intervention or non-government intervention is the answer here? Anybody?
Well, interestingly, the last time we asked about this, which would have been Q4 of 2023, about 60% of Canadians did not, notwithstanding the funding of the CBC, which they see as a different thing, were not supportive of the government subsidies and fundings for newsrooms. And obviously, so much of that, I shouldn't say obviously, so much of that is driven by the political wedge. So much of that is driven by conservative supporters who believe that, well, a liberal government is doing this journalism funding, ergo it's liberal propaganda. I don't believe that entirely to be true, but I think that there are situations where, you know, did a newsroom spike a story or worry about their next, you know, round of funding, or were there considerations around local journalism initiative, whatever it is, because of that? And so from that perspective, you do see a majority who at the time felt like, yes, there are problems with news deserts and the closing of news organizations, but the funding is not necessarily the solution.
Okay. I think that takes us to 2 p.m. I want to thank you guys so much for this conversation. It was great. It was really interesting listening to what you all have to say. Thank you everyone for sending in questions and for tuning in. It's been wonderful. Thank you.